Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here today and welcome everyone to the session. As you just heard, my name is Thabang Mashologu, and just a little bit about me. I started out as an engineer and have worked in the software and open source industry for many years. And I'm currently the VP of marketing at ZenHub, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few seconds. Prior to that, I was the VP of marketing at the Eclipse Foundation, which is one of the world's largest open source foundations, where I was responsible for community outreach and engagement and driving the awareness, adoption, and growth of over 400 open source projects that are used by millions of developers. Just a little bit about ZenHub before we get going in earnest here. ZenHub is a project and productivity management platform that's used by over 4,500 open source projects and public entities. We are the industry's only tool that lets open source project teams plan and track their work across public and private repos in one place. We are used by everyone from the Apache Software Foundation to the Linux Foundation, Grafana, OpenSSL, Red Hat, and many others to code in the open. And we're hearing from these folks and others that our tools allow them to simplify communication and coordination and to give more transparency and visibility to their communities, ultimately to ship releases more frequently and predictably. So today's talk will be based on our learnings from working with these and other leading open source projects, companies, and communities. So now on to the main event. In today's session, we'll start by looking at the macro industry trends and some key ingredients and factors for running successful open source projects. Then we'll look at why productivity management is critically important for open source software development. And we'll introduce and explore a framework for measuring and improving the productivity of open source projects. And finally, we'll walk through some real world examples and open the floor for questions. Let's get started. It's not an overstatement to say that open source participation is surging. And of course, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but open source really is one of the most important and impactful technology trends of our time. It's the lifeblood of the digital economy, and it's the preeminent way that software-based innovation happens today. And just to quantify that impact, over 90% of the code in a typical software application is made up of open source components. So in a really tangible way, open source is the foundation of commercial software. Most or many developers, over 80% of them, are actively involved in projects, either using the code, finding and fixing bugs, and reporting and implementing feature enhancements. And more companies of all sizes across industries and verticals are using the products of open source projects and or incorporating open source in their own products as a way to create value for their customers faster. When you zoom in on startups in particular, that 81% is more like 100%. And many of the fastest growing and most exciting companies out there are not only taking open source and using it, but they're giving back in the way of contributing to upstream projects. They figured out that engaging with projects, creating new ones, and supporting communities can help you not only build better products faster, but it also helps you acquire customers and keep them happy and engaged as part of your overall communities. Just to recap, everyone, open source is truly one of the most transformative trends of our times. And just to further quantify and give you a sense of the scale of the impact and the relevance to our industry, when you look at the economic perspective, the figures really are mind-boggling. So the Linux Foundation has estimated over $54 billion of value has been created by the contributions of their community. And over at the Apache Software Foundation, they've looked at their code base, which represents over 227 million lines of code, and that's being valued at more than $22 billion. And a recent study by the Open Forum Europe organization estimates that open source technologies, and that's open source software and hardware contribute as much as $113 billion annually to Europe's economy. So much like we heard about the banks not too long ago, open source is too big to fail. That's as a technology development and collaboration and distribution model, it really is the fuel that the modern digital economy runs on. Now, I'll posit a question here, which is, if open source is that important, why is it that we're actually using, in some cases, spreadsheets and other outdated tools and manual approaches to manage these development processes that are underpinning these critical resources? If so many people and so many of us on this call and at this conference actively depend on open source, why aren't we measuring and improving productivity of open source projects with the same rigor and urgency and focus that we do for making higher quality proprietary software and making it more efficiently? We need modern tools and frameworks to coordinate and plan and track these collaborative and community-based development processes, and ultimately to ensure that the packages and libraries that we all depend on get delivered in a reliable and timely fashion for users and downstream contributors. Now, looking at that a bit more closely, what that means is in terms of the project management and productivity tools that we use, we need tools that allow us to be open and welcoming for all, and that includes folks that work in multiple organizations. So being able to be inclusive and welcome people from wherever they are, even in some cases competing companies. We need tools that are up to date and accurate, actually based on the code base. Now, that extends as well to being able to guide and automate our processes and eliminate repetitive tasks so that maintainers and contributors can focus on contributing, why they actually came into the ecosystem or community in the first place. We need to be able to support collaboration from people wherever they are. So it's a remote and asynchronous world. And in some ways, or many ways, open source was remote and asynchronous before that became popular and fashionable. So we need to actively be able to support and integrate those efforts and contributions wherever they occur. We need to also provide a central place for people to find and share documentation. And then finally, we need to be able to, as we've discussed, bring that same level of continual and continuous improvement based on measurements and being data-driven to the productivity of open source development teams. What we've got on the right-hand side here is not that. We've got oftentimes closed and permission tools, and we're using spreadsheets and systems that are disconnected from the code. So they require folks to manually update and essentially context switch and take time away from the core valuable work, high leverage work that open source teams are charged with and mandated with. Also, we need to step away from essentially what we've got, which is these manual processes that are resource intensive and require expertise in many cases to customize them for use in the open source world. Yeah, so what does, that's all good and well. And if you heard me before, essentially making the case for productivity management and bringing a lot of these tools that we use in the proprietary world into the open source context. But what does that actually mean in practical terms? Let's start by actually looking what it takes, looking at several of the factors, or key factors rather, that are important and relevant in terms of running a successful, sustainable open source project. First of all, goal setting. So the strategy, if you will, of the project. If you're getting people on a bus, it's really important to pick a destination. You need to have a really clear definition of success for the project. Is it industry adoption? Is it community building? These are necessary conversations that you have to have up front, and that level setting and strategic direction setting is critical. then, and this is if it's in line with your goals and objectives, it's really important to encourage and foster collaboration, support people collaborating, and make it easy for them to co-create value and share knowledge and intellectual property. You've also got to make it open to all. And this is the key learning, certainly from my time at the Eclipse Foundation, is that it's critical to provide the same opportunity for everyone to participate. Everyone should be able to participate with the same rules, and there shouldn't be any roadblocks or impediments in the face of potential contributors, and that includes welcoming people who are potentially competitors in the marketplace. It's important as well to embrace transparency. People often conflate openness and transparency. There's a difference. Transparency really entails making the project plans, discussions, and roadmaps for new features. All of this documentation should be publicly and easily accessible. And then finally, being inclusive rather, and supporting and encouraging diversity. There is a growing body of evidence that teams that are diverse and inclusive perform better. Having those different points of view and skills and experience at the table is really a success factor that helps separate low performers from high performing teams. So actively seeking out and welcoming those different folks at the table, so to speak, is really important for spurring broad-based and sustainable innovation. So with that said, so those are some of the critical success factors for open source projects generally. Let's zero back in on developer productivity. Now, based on some learnings from the proprietary world, and this is some research conducted by the good folks at GitHub, the University of Victoria in Canada, and Microsoft, they've developed what they call the SPACE framework, which is an acronym that stands for satisfaction and well-being, performance, activity, communication and collaboration, and efficiency and flow. They've developed that as a way to understand and measure these and other dimensions of what contributes to productivity on developer teams. And the reason why I personally like this framework, and I think it's really taken on some resonance in the industry, is that, first of all, the first step to improving productivity is to figure out how to measure it. And there's no one size fits all approach. It's complex and it's nuanced. And just like there's no single definition of success, there's no one single measure of productivity. And what historically we've thought of as productivity measures like commit velocity, the number of pull requests approved and merged, and even the lines of code that I was referencing earlier, those really tell only part of the story. So having a broad-based framework like this that speaks to the fact that we're all people, and open source in particular is people powered, and you hear expressions like the community is the capacity. So really you have to look at things in a holistic and also humanistic way, and zero in on the fact that it's about communication among teams and team members, and it's all of that contributes to the mix of productivity and efficiency, including how people feel about the work. So with that in mind, the S, as I mentioned, stands for satisfaction and well-being, and satisfaction in this case is how fulfilled developers feel with their tools, the team, and the environment. Well-being is how healthy and happy they are, and happiness is somewhat underrated as a factor in the success of teams, but development teams. But there's strong evidence that there's a great correlation between the feelings of folks and the productivity. So feelings like how satisfied they are and happy in their work, which kind of makes sense, right? And I guess on the other hand, a decline in satisfaction and engagement could also be indications of burnout and reduced productivity. So satisfaction and well-being is kind of a key element in the mix here. The P is for performance, which is best evaluated in terms of outcomes instead of output, right? So the most simplified view of performance could be, did the code, was the code written in a way to reliably do what it was supposed to do? Does it improve customer satisfaction, adoption, or retention of that customer base? Activity is what most of us typically think of when measuring productivity. I think this is certainly something that is representative of the diversity and complexity of modern software development, because it actually encompasses design and development, CI/CD metrics like build and test and deployments and releases, and also infrastructure utilization. A number of open source communities and foundations do a really good job of understanding and measuring these metrics. But again, they're just part of the story. The DORA metrics, for example, for DevOps would fall into this category of activity measures. Communication and collaboration, as one would expect, they capture how people and teams work together and communicate. So software development is very much a team sport in the modern world, and it relies extensively on effective communication and coordination with a high degree of transparency and awareness within and between teams, especially when you look at complex software and projects. And finally, efficiency and flow captures the ability to complete work and make progress towards it with minimal interruptions and delays. At the individual developer level, it's about getting into the flow. We've heard this expression, getting complex tasks done with minimal distractions or interruptions, context switching, etc. At the team and system level, it's about optimizing flow in a way that minimizes the delays and handoffs in the steps to take software from an idea or a concept all the way through to production. So what are some ways that we can measure and improve productivity in open source projects? Well, looking at the space framework and adapting it slightly to the open source world, some examples come to mind, right? And these are just examples, not exhaustive, but hopefully for illustration purposes, they're helpful. So in terms of satisfaction and well-being, conducting community surveys and sentiment analysis, really trying to get a sense of what your users, adopters, contributors, committers, those maintainers and folks that are involved in the project work, who are involved in the project work and also beneficiaries, what they think of the processes and the work that is being done in that open source project. Yeah, ultimately, a lagging indicator is measuring the overall growth of the project. I think also trying and making efforts to manage the diversity in a community, and the Linux Foundation does a really good job of this, trying to understand how that is improving over time and taking active steps to cultivate and welcome and encourage diverse groups within the context of those projects. Performance could be quality, reliability, so the absence of bugs in the software. So and bigger picture, how it is being adopted by the market and the industry. Activity, as we mentioned, we talked about pull requests and commits and code reviews, those types of tangible activities that the project team is undertaking. From a community and collaboration perspective, you can look at posts and messages, the things that in a community forum that indicate that people are engaged and are interacting with each other. They're asking questions, they're answering it. And also these people are meeting, whether it's online or through physical meetups, they're actually getting together. That connective fabric is being built out. And then efficiency and flow, certainly organizations and foundations like the Eclipse Foundation that have built out comprehensive, robust governance and process frameworks. In that context, actually looking at how effective and efficacious those processes are in the way of minimizing delays and handoffs. How much time are developers and teams able to spend on task? And how easy is it to contribute, and how easy is it to integrate those contributions into the code base? Those are some of the ways that you can measure and in some cases seek to improve productivity in those open source projects. And just a quick double click on some specific examples. What we're seeing in terms of highly productive open source projects is, and companies that are based on open source, is measurements around velocity. So obviously this can be measured in a few different ways. Average velocity from a story point perspective within a defined time frame, so within a sprint. There are also different ways you can look at velocity, such as issue completion, commit velocity, pull request velocity, etc. Cycle time, so for example, the number of days per issue to actually make it through the development stages of the project. Review time and throughput also round out a set of kind of really tangible activity metrics that open source projects are increasingly looking at. So this is a complement and looking at the work that the community is doing in a way that is not only similar to what's happening in the proprietary world, but is a people-centric way of doing things as opposed to just focusing on the infrastructure. One call out here is that, again, since open source software is people powered and it's driven by teams, and there are really many ways to contribute, you want to measure these activities at the team level, not the individual level. So just like in the proprietary world where you don't want to be ranking and stacking developers necessarily, it could be demotivating to be looking at, you know, rock stars and calling people out as rock stars in the community, as opposed to looking holistically what the outcomes are that are resulting from some of these metrics. Now, let's take a look at some real world examples. I should underline and underscore at this point that the screenshots are from tools that are free for open source projects. So what we're seeing is that increasingly projects and companies that are active in the open source world are using these tools initially on a free basis and achieving some measure of success with them. First off, looking at Swagger API. So this is a project and a suite of open source tools that no doubt many of us on this call are familiar with. They're used by millions of API developers to design, document, test, and deploy APIs. SmartBear, the company behind Swagger, uses modern productivity management tools to make it easier to manage multiple GitHub repositories, 33 repositories rather, in the same workspace. So this is a unified environment where community members and staff of the company that's behind the project are able to coordinate and collaborate in advancing the technologies. So they're able to do so simply with numerous contributors around the world, both internally and externally to their organization. And what we're looking at on the screen here is, excuse me, is a board view where you're able to organize the different issues and pull requests and other artifacts from the project in a way that maps directly to the development process. And this is what community members would see. Behind this is a private repository that only SmartBear staff have access to. So really you're able to bridge those worlds of open source, community-driven work and also private repositories for proprietary work. So this notion of upstream and downstream and being able to manage both from one view. By bringing these multiple repositories and tools into one space, the team, the extended team that spans the Smart Bear company and their community creates a single source of truth. As it pertains to productivity management, so measuring and improving productivity, the team is able to use their tools to see the throughput and cycle time, excuse me, which they're then able to use to become more productive. As issues flow through the workspace, that board view that we were talking about, that Kanban style board, they're able to visualize the issues and track how much work is accumulating within each development stage. And that ability to see cycle time and lead time can help predict how quickly upcoming issues will be closed, and also to predict the average completion time of issues. All of these contribute to providing stakeholders with visibility, so people who rely on these technologies are able to have visibility and can identify blockers and bottlenecks in their process and anomalies in specific areas of the processes. So this is the kind of thing that helps more holistically in terms of ensuring that the end-to-end development process undertaken by the Swagger API team is more efficient. Just looking at another example, the NARCS project, which was initially developed by Red Hat and contributed to open source, is a framework for deploying workloads to securely isolate environments in the public cloud. The project team uses modern tools to maintain a unified view of their code base, which is distributed across many repositories. Within a single workspace, they're able to manage these various contributions from different organizations. So again, this notion of being able to welcome and integrate the contributions of people across multiple organizations and community members, and also to streamline processes by using automation. So rather than having to manually move issues between the various development stages, they're able to use these tools to automate those processes. At scale, and particularly in an open source context where you have people, distributed over multiple time zones and in many countries. And by the way, that's a measure of success. As we established, you want more people who are all over the world using and being involved in the project. At scale, this is the kind of thing that eliminating those kind of verbal handoffs and meetings is really difficult to accomplish if you're not using an approach like this. So in an async open source world with this distributed network of contributors, it becomes very important to be able to have this functionality, this level of automation. The NARCS project also uses road mapping tools, and this is powerful in the sense that you're able to, by sharing a URL, provide common visibility as to the progress, so the current status, and more importantly, the expected, or equally importantly, rather, the expected delivery date of features, right? So if I'm an adopter of the project, I'm able to have a measure of certainty and accuracy that I can use to plan my commercial feature development, my commercial product development. Their roadmap is updated automatically based on what the tool, or rather what the team is doing in GitHub. So as issues are completed, as PRs are merged, this automatically gets reflected in this roadmap. And projects and epics are tracked by story points and issues completed, which all enables, again, anyone anywhere in the world who's interested in this project to have real-time visibility into the progress of each chunk of work. That makes for more visibility and transparency with fewer meetings. So community members have a better understanding of progress and also the future direction of the open source product. So with that, and as we kind of enter in the final stretch here of the presentation, I did want to just underline and summarize some of the key takeaways from the talk. First of all, it is critically important to set clear goals and foster collaboration, support openness and transparency, and create a welcoming environment for diverse participants. it's important to do all of that as part of a set of proven ingredients for successful and sustainable open source projects. Number one. Number two, it's 2022 and it is time to ditch the spreadsheets and manual ways of updating of progress in open source projects and measuring and driving productivity improvements that we're seeing in open source projects. Ultimately, open source projects need to take a page from a tooling and process perspective out of the books of the proprietary world and leverage these tools, these modern tools that can help increase the quality, reliability, and predictability of open source project releases. Open source is way too important to leave to anything less. And I will add that many vendors offer their tools at no cost or reduced cost to open source projects. So price really shouldn't be, and lock-in shouldn't be an impediment to folks. And in fact, I'll frame it this way: what is there to lose, right? So I think there's with a reduction in these or greater availability of these tools at low cost, it's certainly something that we encourage open source projects to look at very closely. With that, I will open the floor to questions. I'm just going to switch gears here and stop sharing, and so I'll be able to see the Q&A. Encouraging folks to ask any questions. And thank you everyone for sticking with us as we had those technical difficulties. Moderator, are you seeing any questions on it?
Yeah, Thabang, so that was a very good talk. Thank you for your talk. And I think the participants enjoyed because we see the numbers are only growing even after the interruptions. So I think they really liked your talk and want to hear what you speak. And now for the participants, I think you can share questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and then Thabang will answer them for you on the video.
Okay. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I do want to emphasize that we'll share this deck, presentation materials, and I'm also free to answer any questions offline after the fact as well.
Yeah, sure. I think participants are yet to post the questions, but I myself am an open source contributor, and I contribute to one of the projects in Linux Foundation. I'm also a co-maintainer. So one question I would like to ask is, sometimes when we have issues that are not, we have roadmaps and other things, and we are not able to map it to the platforms. For example, we say we use one thing like GitHub or something, and we have an external tool. How do you think we can seamlessly work across tools? I mean, I'm not quoting about a specific tool, but how do you work across different tools? Because we see that not a single tool is able to provide all the functionalities that we need. Do you have some comments on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's certainly something that we hear articulated often by our customers and community members. And this is where you've seen some open source foundations. The Eclipse Foundation is one that I know from direct experience, but others do this as well. Cloud Foundry, as an example, where they have built out their own tool stack, right? So they've invested, they've invested resources and time, money, of course, in developing out their own infrastructure that does, for example, give you a view of not only infrastructure performance and reliability, so SLAs around the infrastructure, right? So the build infrastructure, but then you're also seeing in the case of the Eclipse Foundation, where they have KPIs, they have commits by contributors and that kind of metric that they track as well, and the feedback. And I know the Cloud Foundry and other Linux Foundation foundations also do that. So so I think working within that foundation context, there's an approach there. But I think you're absolutely right to highlight the fact that there is a problem, right? There's an
Yeah.
unsolved problem here, or at least if and I don't want to just tell people to get ZenHub because we do that.
Yeah.
But by the way, that's one thing that we actually do,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
we've seen a lot of growth from open source projects because there isn't any one tool that sucks in, particularly GitHub
Yeah.
information
Correct.
that allows that. Yeah. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it answered your question, because in particular, I was facing one issue that we were hosting a repository on one of the products, like one of the popular repository hosting products, and then we want to run our CI. We liked one CI product, but it gave us a lot of features and is there in the market for a long time. But we switched
Yes,
to another product just because of integration issues.
that's it.
So it seems to be like a very important factor in making decisions, though we have very productive tools. Using them along together in the mix, it becomes a challenge, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. I mean, the whole nature of open source is that, we're trying to integrate our worlds and be open across technologies. But then, yeah, we're not seeing that from a tooling perspective where you have these islands and separations and yeah. So I think that there's some work to be done in the industry to support more more connectivity and integration, I think, from a stack perspective.
Yeah, true. I totally agree with you. And participants, if you have any questions, feel free to share them in the Q&A or chat, or you can also raise your hands and then ask it directly. So we wait some more minutes for questions.
Yes.
Since we will wait, I also have another question for you. So
Sure.
from an organizational perspective, because I worked representing my organization for 2 years in open source, so that answered you answered that question. But what happens if I start an open source project out of my hobby for personal contributions? What kind of tool stack do I imagine on? Because that is the different thing where I don't have much of time and resource, but I also want other people to know that they are free to come on and contribute and other things, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think let's acknowledge the fact that, just from a source code management perspective, most people live within GitHub, right? So
Yeah.
I think taking advantage of the tools that GitHub has natively is something that I would recommend, and that extends to community building, right? So having a really good README that encourages people that, hey, this is for you and it's open for you to contribute and to use and tell your friends about. I think people underestimate how GitHub can be used as a marketing tool, right?
Yeah, I totally
I also yeah, I also think as technologists, and I started out as an engineer, as I mentioned before I came over to the dark side of marketing and that kind of thing. But I think as technical people, we often are hesitant to promote ourselves, right? There's a tendency as an engineer or a software developer that you feel like, hey, the work should speak for itself. The reality is that unless people know, it's unless people know about their work, your work, they won't use it, right? So that is really important to promote, and I think maybe just to use one of the biggest rules of marketing is that you go to where people are, right? So if you find that people who you think would want to use your tool are in Reddit, or if they're in Twitter or on one of these social media platforms, you should go and talk about your project and your work and invite people to participate on those channels. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that answered your question, because there are two different worlds of contributing on behalf of company and then personally, and you answered both of them in a very beautiful way. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Tabang. It was a wonderful presentation, and we also enjoyed your Q&A session. I think you took very interesting questions and answered them beautifully. Have a nice day, and that brings us to the end of the talk. And we also thank our sponsors, Indeed, for their sponsorship.